In the winter of 1942, as the snows deepened across the Eastern Front, a little-known intelligence briefing circulated through British War Office corridors. It noted that German forward spearheads had crossed the Volga in multiple sectors, and that what remained of Soviet command structures was non-responsive or non-existent. Few at the time realized the significance of this document. Fewer still understood the implications should the Red Army's defenses collapse entirely. But this first hint, this single sheet of paper, would mark the beginning of one of the most dramatic shifts in the global balance of power during the Second World War. For the men on the ground, the struggle felt immediate and visceral. At Stalingrad, what remained of the Soviet 62nd Army dissolved under unrelenting German pressure. In the Caucasus, the 44th and 58th Armies attempted a desperate retreat through frozen mountain passes, leaving heavy equipment abandoned along the roadways. Refugees flowed westward, unsure if Soviet authority still existed. Rumors swirled of NKVD detachments disappearing, not retreating, of political officers burning documents instead of evacuating them. To British and American analysts observing the chaos from Tehran and Cairo, the collapse seemed less like defeat and more like disintegration. Wide, sudden, and total. Inside the Special Operations Executive Headquarters on Baker Street, analysts sifted through intercepted radio traffic from Moscow. One note from December 3, marked Urgent, Priority 1, referenced the unexplained disappearance of several Allied liaison officers assigned to Soviet front headquarters. These men, attached to monitor Lend-Lease distribution and provide intelligence coordination, had vanished somewhere between Kybyshev and Sverdlovsk. Their last known transmission was a routine logistical report. After that, silence. Meanwhile, the U.S. Office of Strategic Services struggled to piece together its own picture of events. Reports arriving via the Persian corridor contradicted one another. A Soviet captain described frantic evacuations of industrial equipment. An engineer from Magnitogorsk insisted that plants had been instructed to prepare for demolition. But a Soviet railway commissar claimed he had orders to maintain eastbound civilian routes at any cost, an impossible directive given the circumstances. "Someone is issuing orders," one OSS officer wrote in a field journal, "but we are no longer certain who that someone is." Historical records from the time show that the Allied governments were preparing for disaster long before the public understood its severity. Winston Churchill, speaking to the Chiefs of Staff Committee, warned that a German victory in the East could allow Hitler to redeploy over 100 divisions. If the Soviet line broke permanently, the Wehrmacht could reposition men and armor from Stalingrad to Normandy, from Smolensk to Sicily. A strategic nightmare was unfolding in real time. Yet for all the broader strategic implications, it was the small details, the lost officers, the untraceable Soviet commands, the contradictory evacuations, that troubled Allied intelligence most. One particularly revealing document came from a British attaché stationed in Baku. He wrote of meeting a Soviet colonel who seemed unaware that his own frontline command had been overrun 3 days prior. He insisted reinforcements were coming, the attaché noted, but could not say from where. He spoke like a man reciting instructions he no longer believed. As the Soviet collapse accelerated, the mystery surrounding missing Allied personnel deepened. The American officer Captain James Holbrook, stationed near Saratov to oversee aircraft deliveries, was last seen boarding a military train said to be heading east. However, subsequent German reports, captured weeks later, claimed no such train had ever reached its intended destination. It simply disappeared between stations. No wreckage was found. No survivors reported. A train filled with American equipment, Soviet escorts, and at least one Western liaison officer vanished into a landscape now controlled by advancing German reconnaissance units. From modern vantage points, historians often debate whether these disappearances resulted from chaos, deliberate Soviet secrecy, or German interception. But contemporary accounts reveal something more unsettling. Even those directly involved were unsure of the truth. OSS Director William Donovan wrote privately that the fog surrounding the Eastern Front is no longer metaphorical. It is literal uncertainty. We cannot verify movement, command, or survival. The collapse of the USSR in late 1942 reshaped everything the Allies believed about the war's trajectory. It shifted strategic priorities, redrew supply routes, and forced London and Washington to consider a world where Germany commanded the heart of Eurasia. But it also opened a dark ledger of unanswered questions. Questions about vanished men, lost commands, and broken lines of communication that would haunt investigators for years. As Germany redirected its armies deeper into the Soviet interior and the Allies braced for the consequences, one question lingered above all others. How much had been lost in the chaos, and what critical pieces of intelligence had slipped away with the officers who never returned? The answer would begin to emerge only in the early months of 1943, when reconnaissance flights over the Urals revealed traces of movements no Allied planner had anticipated, leading directly into the events of Part 2. In early 1943, as winter loosened its grip on the ruined landscapes of southern Russia and the Caucasus, a previously overlooked piece of intelligence resurfaced inside the British Middle East Command. It was a thin, typewritten memo from a team of U.S. Army engineers who had traveled the Persian corridor months earlier, one noting the existence of abandoned Soviet supply depots scattered across northern Iran. The document described crates left unopened, vehicles half-fueled and unclaimed, and logistical maps pinned to walls as though their owners had stepped out only moments before. At the time, the report had seemed trivial. But in the wake of the USSR's collapse, it took on a darker significance. These depots were not just abandoned, they appeared to have been evacuated in haste, without coordination, and without any surviving record of where the personnel had gone. The struggle for control of the greater Middle East tightened with alarming speed. With the Soviet front disintegrating, German Army Group South rerouted elements of the 1st Panzer Army toward the Caucasus and, potentially, beyond. British commanders in the region watched anxiously as Wehrmacht movements shifted. The 8th Army, fresh from its victories in North Africa, prepared emergency defenses stretching from Baghdad to Basra and onward to the Suez Canal. If the Germans managed to force their way through the Caucasus oil fields or link with Axis-aligned forces in the region, the consequences could be catastrophic. Yet these fears were compounded by something far less visible but equally troubling: the vacuum of information left behind by retreating Soviet units. 4 U.S. personnel stationed along the Persian corridor, the crucial route through which American Lend-Lease supplies flowed to the former Soviet Union, the atmosphere became eerie. Major William Kerr, a logistics officer from the U.S. Army's Services of Supply Command, described arriving at an airfield near Kazvin, once used as a staging point for Soviet aircraft transfers. According to his diary, hangar doors stood open, tools lay scattered on the floor, and maps of the Volga front remained pinned to a planning board. No guards. No officers. No aircraft. It looked, Kerr wrote, as though an entire squadron had been erased. The deeper Allied investigators went, the stranger the evidence became. At a depot east of Hamadan, U.S. engineers found several wooden crates filled with classified Soviet documents. Personnel rosters, evacuation orders, production schedules, many stamped with the seal of the State Defense Committee. But the final pages of these documents were missing, as though torn out deliberately. One incomplete file referenced a Soviet plan titled Zopaz 14, apparently meant to coordinate emergency withdrawals of industrial assets from the Urals. Yet no such withdrawal had occurred. Had the plan been cancelled? Or had it commenced but been interrupted, overtaken by the speed of the German advance? Insight from British sources only deepened the sense of confusion. An SOE liaison officer in Tehran reported that local Soviet diplomats refused to comment on the missing evacuees, insisting they had no knowledge of military directives from Moscow. Meanwhile, a Persian railway official described trains filled with Soviet civilians heading east toward the Caspian Sea. Yet none of these trains were recorded in Soviet manifests. "We saw them pass," the official told Allied intelligence, "but no one ever saw them arrive." Whether the civilians had been relocated to remote settlements or lost during the evacuation remained unclear. No Allied officer could provide an answer. In the spring of 1943, aerial reconnaissance missions conducted jointly by the RAF and U.S. Army Air Forces amplified the mystery. Pilots scanning routes from Tabriz to Astrakhan reported seeing long columns of railcars abandoned on tracks leading north into the mountains. Some appeared derailed. Others looked intact but deserted. Several heavy lift wagons contained machinery from factories as far east as Chelyabinsk, equipment supposedly evacuated by the Soviets, but there were no operatives, no guards, no instructions, nothing to explain why such valuable material had been left behind. This was when the most troubling discovery emerged. At an isolated railway junction south of the Caspian Sea, an American reconnaissance team found a series of sealed railcars marked with Soviet military insignia. When they pried open the doors, they found empty interiors, except for a few scattered documents referring to liaison officers known to have disappeared months earlier. Had these officers been moved through this junction? Were they captured, evacuated, or stranded during the chaos of retreat? The papers inside provided no names, no clear references, only coded initials and dates that did not align with any known movements. As historians reflect on this period, many believe these signs pointed to a massive Soviet attempt to regroup in the East, an effort overtaken by events. Modern analysts suggest the Soviet evacuation plans were simply overwhelmed by the speed of German advances. But some elements remain unresolved: the missing liaison teams, the unrecorded trains, the incomplete directives. These anomalies hint not just at chaos, but at decisions made under immense pressure, decisions whose outcomes left no witnesses. For the men tasked with interpreting these clues in 1943, the uncertainty weighed heavily. Every missing report, every vanished convoy, every unclaimed depot represented a piece of the puzzle the Allies desperately needed to understand Germany's next strategic move. What had been lost? What might the Axis forces find? And could any of it change the course of the war? As German divisions redeployed across former Soviet territory and Allied intelligence sifted through the fragments of abandoned plans, one question began to dominate strategic discussions. If these gaps in information were overlooked, what other movements might the Allies fail to see? Movements that could shape the war's next, perilous phase? That answer would emerge from the skies over the Urals, beginning with a reconnaissance flight that never returned. In the early months of 1943, as the vastness of the former Soviet Union lay exposed under German occupation, Allied commanders shifted their attention from the chaos on the ground to what might still be hidden in the skies above the Urals. One obscure intelligence memorandum captured at the time referenced large-scale industrial assets, believed to have been relocated east of Sverdlovsk, assets the Germans had not yet secured. This small detail, noted almost in passing by an RAF analyst, would shape months of reconnaissance missions. The idea that fragments of Soviet command, or at least remnants of their industrial defenses, could still exist sparked a surge of aerial activity from British and American units. But what began as simple reconnaissance soon turned into an investigation marked by silence, disappearance, and unanswered questions. The struggle for clarity fell primarily on the RAF's photographic reconnaissance units, operating from hastily expanded bases in Persia and northern Iraq. Flying stripped-down Spitfire PR variants, painted a pale sky blue for evasion, pilots conducted long-range sweeps over regions no Western aircraft had surveyed before. The distances were immense. Fuel margins were thin. Pilots described the landscape below as a continent of snow, shadow, and steel. Every flight carried the risk of engine failure, disorientation, or interception by German aircraft patrolling the newly conquered territories. The human challenge was relentless. One pilot, Flight Lieutenant Arthur Paxton, recorded in his logbook an encounter with fierce headwinds high over the Kazakh steppe. Fuel gauges dropped faster than expected. With instruments frosting over and no clear markers on the ground, he was forced to turn back early. "There is nothing down there," he wrote. "Nothing but frozen emptiness. If anything moves across that land, it leaves no trace." Paxton survived, but several of his fellow aviators would not be as fortunate. As the reconnaissance intensified, the insights gathered began to reshape Allied assessments. Analysts studying aerial photographs noticed abandoned rail terminals deep in the Urals, some still loaded with machinery from factories once planned for evacuation. An OSS dispatch noted that certain transport hubs showed evidence of recent activity: tracks brushed clean, equipment positioned in rows, yet no workers or guards were present. In one set of images taken east of Orenburg, A cluster of buildings bore signs of hurried abandonment. Doors left open, fuel drums overturned, and staging platforms littered with documents scattered by the wind. But it was the discovery of several unmarked airstrips, freshly flattened and aligned for medium bombers, that raised new questions. These improvised runways did not correspond to any known Soviet defensive plan. Intelligence officers speculated they might have been last-ditch evacuation sites for high-ranking personnel or mobile industrial brigades. Yet the airstrips appeared unused, as though the operations they were built for never took place. The reveal that shifted everything came in late April 1943. During a joint RAF-USSR mission, a reconnaissance flight identified a convoy of railcars deep in the Kazakh interior, seemingly intact and completely isolated. The images showed dozens of flatbeds carrying partially disassembled machinery, generators, and locomotive parts. The significance was immediately apparent. This equipment matched serial numbers from Soviet factories that had supposedly been evacuated weeks earlier. But according to German field reports, which the Allies routinely intercepted, no such convoy had been captured, destroyed, or even sighted. It was as if the railcars had been left to await instructions that never arrived. Then came the disappearance. On May 2, 1943, an RAF Mosquito PR.34, crewed by pilot officer Leonard Marsh and navigator Douglas Fenton, departed from an advanced airstrip near Kermanshah for a survey of the same region. Their objective was to verify whether the abandoned rail convoy had moved. Radio contact remained routine for the first 2 hours. The crew reported clear weather and minimal turbulence. Then their transmissions abruptly ceased. When Marsh and Fenton failed to return, a search operation was launched. Over several days, RAF and USSR aircraft swept hundreds of miles of steppe. No wreckage was found. No smoke plumes. No emergency beacons. Nothing. The Mosquito had vanished as though swallowed by the vast landscape below. Were they intercepted by German fighters? Perhaps. But Luftwaffe logs for that day, captured weeks later, showed no engagements in the region. A mechanical failure? Possible, yet even a catastrophic crash would have left debris, oil spills, or a fire visible from the air. Sabotage? Unlikely, given the aircraft's secure staging area. The incident deepened the mystery of the unclaimed Soviet convoys and abandoned depots. Modern historians still debate the disappearance. Some believe the Mosquito went down in remote terrain far from the search grid. Others propose the aircraft may have descended into a canyon or frozen riverbed now lost to time. But at the moment of its loss, Allied planners feared something else entirely. That German forces were conducting clandestine operations far beyond their reported positions. Operations concealed from both Allied and Soviet records. The loss of the reconnaissance crew cast a long shadow across the intelligence community. It suggested not just uncertainty, but danger, hidden movements and unknown hazards within the vast silence of former Soviet territory. And as questions mounted, the OSS intercepted a new series of German communications containing references to an unfamiliar codename: Operation Edelstein. What Edelstein entailed, and how it connected to the growing mystery in the East, would only become clearer in the months to follow, setting the stage for the unfolding tensions of Part 4. By the summer of 1943, as Allied commanders sifted through reconnaissance reports and the troubling disappearance of the Mosquito crew, a new thread of intelligence surfaced, one that pushed the mystery deeper into the heart of German wartime planning. It began with a single intercepted communication, a fragment of coded traffic from the German High Command referencing Edelstein. At first, it was dismissed as another logistical note. But as more transmissions surfaced, each repeating the same codename in relation to troop transfers inside conquered Soviet territory, analysts in London and Washington realized something critical. Edelstein was not a routine movement. It was a major operation. The struggle to interpret its meaning strained Allied intelligence networks. With the Soviet Union gone, Germany possessed unprecedented freedom to shift armies across the east. Divisions once locked in brutal combat around Stalingrad and Kursk now redeployed westward, toward Normandy, toward the Balkans, toward southern Italy. British and American planners watched the redeployments with growing alarm. Every German division transferred west was one more obstacle to any future Allied landing in Europe. Yet alongside these visible troop movements, there remained an unexplained pattern. Several elite formations, including elements of the 3rd Panzergrenadier Division and the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, were reported shifting east, deeper into former Soviet industrial zones rather than toward active fronts. This contradiction sharpened attention toward Operation Edelstein. Analysts at Bletchley Park began cross-referencing intercepted communications, German rail logs, and Luftwaffe transport manifests. The data suggested the operation involved securing or relocating Soviet industrial assets, precisely the kind of equipment that reconnaissance flights had spotted abandoned in the Urals. But the operation's scale and secrecy went beyond simple salvage work. Axis-aligned rail networks were observed operating at full capacity in regions far beyond their reported administrative zones, including the Chelyabinsk and Magnitogorsk corridors. A diary entry from Lieutenant Thomas Keane, a British signals officer stationed in Cairo, offered a telling insight. "The Germans are moving something," he wrote, "but they are not broadcasting what or why. Their encrypted traffic is dense, fragmented, and unusually repetitive. When they conceal this much, it means something valuable is at stake." Keane's observation echoed fears growing within the Allied command. If Germany gained control of the Soviet Union's industrial heartland intact, it could sustain a far longer war, one the Western Allies might not be able to win. The reveal came from an unexpected source. An OSS agent operating out of Istanbul reported overhearing a former Romanian officer speak of German engineers assessing factories east of the Volga. Facilities still partially functional, despite the chaos of the Soviet retreat. The officer claimed the Germans had found railway depots filled with equipment, waiting for relocation, as though the Soviets had intended to continue the war from the Far East. But the most striking detail was his claim that German special units, likely technical teams attached to the Reich Ministry for Armaments, had orders to move specific machines and personnel to undisclosed locations before the Allies realized what Germany had acquired. Within weeks, more pieces of the puzzle surfaced. Aerial reconnaissance revealed columns of trucks moving through the southern Urals, their canvas covers concealing their loads. Analysts identified German armored cars escorting these convoys, an unusual allocation of resources unless the cargo held strategic significance. Meanwhile, Luftwaffe transport activity increased around Orenburg and Ufar, airfields not previously known for major operations. Each observation pointed to a single conclusion. Operation Edelstein involved consolidating critical Soviet industrial assets before the Allies could intervene. Yet other insights complicated the picture. An intercepted message noted the involvement of Sondertrupp 8, a special action detachment not listed in known German operational records. This absence raised immediate suspicion within Allied intelligence circles. Units of this type often handled tasks too sensitive for conventional reporting: purges, seizures, and covert transfers. Their presence in former Soviet territory suggested Edelstein might include more than industrial capture. It might involve securing documents, scientists, or intelligence officers, possibly even the missing Allied liaison teams. As Allied analysts worked to decipher these clues, field reports painted an increasingly fragmented picture. One reconnaissance image showed a line of rail cars sealed shut, stationed on a siding outside of Magnitogorsk, guarded by SS troops. But when the next reconnaissance sweep passed over the area, the rail cars were gone, without any trace of their departure or destination. In Persia, a joint US-UK intelligence review of Soviet evacuation documents unearthed references to priority assets, designated for transfer out of the Urals. The documents abruptly ended after listing several research institutes and key personnel. No follow-up orders existed. The Soviets had planned to move something vital, but the collapse had interrupted their efforts. Modern historians still debate whether Operation Edelstein was intended to exploit the Soviet collapse, secure war-critical resources, or locate surviving Soviet command fragments. But for Allied planners in 1943, the uncertainty was debilitating. If Germany consolidated former Soviet production capacity, the balance of power could tip decisively. If the Germans captured specialists or intelligence officers, The Allies risked losing information crucial to long-term strategy. And if missing Allied personnel had fallen into German hands, the consequences could be even more dire. By the autumn of 1943, one conclusion became unavoidable. The Germans were concealing something large within the ruins of the Soviet East, something that went beyond factories and machinery. The disappearance of entire convoys, sealed railcars, and reconnaissance aircraft hinted at operations deliberately shrouded from Allied view. With Allied leadership demanding clarity, a decision was made. If answers could not be found from above, they would have to be sought on the ground. This led to the formation of a joint OSS-SOE covert mission, tasked with entering the former Soviet North and uncovering what Germany was really doing. Their story, and their fate, would shape the events of Part 5. In the final weeks of 1943, as the mystery surrounding Operation Edelstein deepened, Allied intelligence reached a tipping point. The fragments collected from aerial surveys, intercepted German traffic, and abandoned Soviet documents all pointed toward something concealed within the vast and desolate territories of the former USSR. But the Allies lacked what they needed most: human eyes on the ground. This gap drove the creation of one of the most unusual covert missions of the war, a joint OSS-SOE operation into the abandoned northern Soviet territories, launched not to sabotage, not to assassinate, but simply to understand what was happening. The mission, designated Harbinger, brought together a small team of British and American operatives trained for deep reconnaissance. Leading the group was Major Henry Talbot of the SOE, a veteran of Balkan operations whose calm demeanor masked a fearless instinct for field intelligence. Accompanying him were OSS Captain Michael Reeves, a signals expert, and Sergeant William Harding, a linguist fluent in Russian. The team carried basic arms, portable radios, and winterized equipment. Their brief was simple: infiltrate the Arkhangelsk region, locate any evidence of German consolidation efforts, and investigate reports of missing Allied liaison personnel who had last transmitted from that corridor months earlier. Their struggle began the moment they crossed into former Soviet territory. Dropped at night by a stripped-down RAF Hudson onto a frozen lakeshore southeast of Mezan, they found themselves entering a world that had been effectively erased from the maps of both belligerents. The cold was brutal. Snowdrifts swallowed abandoned villages whole. Tracks that had once been maintained by Soviet forestry units were now indistinguishable from the wilderness. "This land consumes movement," Captain Reeves wrote in his notebook. "It erases intention. Whatever has passed here leaves no memory." Still, the team pressed onward. They encountered remnants of Soviet evacuations, destroyed vehicles, burnt-out radio posts, crates of papers left half open, pages torn loose and drifting across the snow. In one cabin, they discovered a Soviet field journal describing frantic efforts to coordinate last-minute relocations of personnel from research facilities around Kirov. The entries stopped abruptly on October 19, 1942, with one final sentence: "Evacuation delayed. Waiting for instructions." There were no further notes. The team soon found early signs of German encroachment. Near an abandoned airstrip, they spotted tire tracks belonging to light armored vehicles. A discarded ration tin marked with Wehrmacht serial codes confirmed German presence, although there were no fresh signs of occupation. What puzzled Major Talbot was the absence of defensive positions. "If this was a German staging area," he remarked in a voice recording, "why did they not fortify it? What were they passing through so quickly that they did not bother to dig in?" 3 days later, a more unsettling discovery emerged. The team located a derelict Soviet freight station on a secondary line leading toward Arkhangelsk. Inside the station house lay scattered Soviet railway logs, but among them was a single crumpled sheet containing English handwriting. It appeared to be a torn section of a field report authored by Lieutenant Charles Dayton, one of the American liaison officers who had vanished the previous winter. Only a few lines were legible: "Moved north of designated route. Escort units missing. Attempting to regroup." The rest had been ripped away, or never finished. No signatures. No dates. No indication of his final location. "Someone reached this station after the Soviet collapse," Harding noted. "Someone who wasn't supposed to be alone." Insight from local civilians, few as they were, offered little clarity. The operatives encountered a surviving group of Russian villagers who had remained in hiding during the German advance. Through Harding's translation, they learned of German columns seen moving east with great haste. One elderly woman claimed a train, sealed, heavily guarded, had passed through weeks after the front had dissolved. The soldiers did not allow anyone near it, she said. No one knew where it was going. Her account matched other scattered reports the OSS had gathered of concealed German rail movements through the region. The reveal came on the 12th day of the mission. Deep in the forest, Talbot's team reached a rail junction identified in Soviet records as a major transfer point for industrial evacuations. They expected ruins. Instead, they found something far stranger: the remains of large wooden crates marked with German stenciling, recently broken open and emptied. Nearby, footprints and tire tracks suggested a rapid withdrawal. But what chilled the team was what they found inside a small adjacent shack: scraps of Allied-issue ration wrappers and a burned patch of ground containing fragments of an American radio crate. These were unmistakably Western. Whether they had belonged to missing liaison officers or a separate, unknown group remained unclear. Then, late that night, they intercepted a German transmission on a low-frequency channel. The signal was faint, distorted, and brief, but one phrase cut through the static clearly: Edelstein transport complete. This message, originating from somewhere west of their position, implied the Germans had already removed whatever they had come to take. Determined to pursue the lead, the team attempted to move toward the presumed origin point of the signal. But within 48 hours, their own transmissions began to deteriorate. Their last coherent message to Tehran read: multiple sets of tracks heading north, equipment abandoned, investigating. After that, only fragments reached Allied receivers. When a recovery team was dispatched weeks later, they found no trace of Talbot, Reeves, or Harding. Only their initial landing gear cache remained, untouched. Their disappearance became one more entry in the growing ledger of unanswered questions that defined the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1942. And as Allied strategists grappled with their loss, a darker realization settled across London and Washington. The Germans were not merely scavenging the ruins of the USSR, they were curating something, moving something, concealing something. The westward redeployments were only half the story. The full scale of what had changed, and what the world now faced, would come into focus only in the next year, ushering in the stark realities of Part 6. As the European war entered its final grinding months, Allied commanders faced a question they never expected to confront: how to understand an enemy whose strategies now appeared fractured, contradictory, and increasingly desperate. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1942 had left Germany in command of a vast, resource-rich continent, but it was a victory that had begun to rot from the inside. By early 1945, the Wehrmacht was overstretched across nearly 3,000 miles of front and engaged in a deadly game of delay as the US 8th and 9th Armies surged across the Rhine. Yet within this vast battlefield, Allied intelligence detected a pattern that didn't fit. Units that should have been retreating were instead holding firm around specific installations, sites barely marked on any map, yet fiercely defended. The Americans who encountered these strange pockets of resistance often had no idea what they were stepping into. One such force, the U.S. 2nd Ranger Battalion, advancing near the wooded highlands north of Kassel, found their route blocked by a series of fortified bunkers unlike any they had seen in Normandy or the Ardennes. Booby-trapped approaches, intersecting fire lanes, and unusually precise German mortar fire suggested something critical was concealed within the hills. When the Rangers breached the final line, they found an administrative complex still warm with activity. Documents burning in stoves, diesel generators running, and instruments humming on abandoned tables. But the personnel had vanished minutes earlier, leaving behind only fragments. Code sheets, a half-destroyed map, and a single phrase scrawled in a margin: Hessisches Protocol, Phase Dre. Technical intelligence officers rushed the material to SHAEF headquarters. Analysts compared it to earlier reports gathered by the British 11th Armoured Division during their drive toward Lubeck. Abandoned sites designed not for troop command but for resource coordination, oil, rail traffic, synthetic fuel production, and long-range logistics. These were the invisible seams holding the German war machine together. And yet, every time the Allies closed in on one of these nodes, the defenders fought with an intensity far beyond that of typical rearguard actions. Why pour lives into protecting paperwork and planning boards when the war was clearly lost? Diary entries found in a burned-out staff car near Halberstadt offered a clue. One officer of the German Transportation Corps wrote, "If we cannot deliver eastbound by April, the Japanese insist they will reconsider the timetable." What timetable? For what? American analysts wondered whether a final, desperate transfer of technology or material, perhaps jet engines, or refined fuel, or the V-2's guidance components, was intended for Japan via submarine or long-range aircraft. The thought chilled commanders in the Pacific, where the Battle of Okinawa was already underway. Across northern Germany, British armored units faced parallel mysteries. The 7th Armored Division, advancing on Wismar, found a former Luftwaffe test facility with its underground vaults dynamited from within. Shards of aircraft fuselage, unfamiliar alloys, and fragments of blueprints survived only in splintered form. All of it destroyed with deliberation, Major Ian Darrow reported. Not the panic of retreat, but the cold intent of denial. Darrow also noted that some rooms were left untouched, as if whomever executed the purge was interrupted or forced to flee prematurely. One vault contained an intact crate bearing Japanese naval markings. Inside were gyroscopes and precision tools manufactured months earlier, evidence of an active, high-level exchange long after Germany's defeat became inevitable. As SHAEF pieced these discoveries together, a troubling pattern emerged. The Germans had used their exorbitant territorial gains after the fall of the USSR to develop a networked logistics empire stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Urals. Even as their armies disintegrated, they fought to protect not their front lines, but the skeleton of a wartime economic machine designed for long-term endurance, and possibly handoff. To whom, and for what strategic purpose, remained unclear. The war's end came too swiftly for deeper investigation. In the last days of April, as Allied units met the remnants of the German government in ruins and safehouses, intelligence officers searched desperately for answers. But many key administrators had fled, vanished into the chaos, or been killed in unmarked engagements. Others refused to speak. "We planned for a military victory," one US analyst reflected, "but we never planned for victory without explanation." When the war in Europe finally concluded on May 8, 1945, the surviving documents were sealed in classified archives. Reports noted strange gaps, shipments without destinations, schedules without origins, and references to entities that appeared on no organizational chart. Decades later, historians still debate the purpose of the Hessisches Protocol or why certain German facilities were defended far beyond any rational military value. The collapse of the USSR in 1942 had reshaped the war, but it also had produced questions the Allies never fully resolved. And as the world shifted focus toward rebuilding, the Pacific War, and eventually the Cold War, these fragments remained a quiet, unanswered footnote of an altered global conflict. Pieces of a puzzle scattered across burned documents, abandoned bunkers, and testimonies lost to time. What Germany truly intended in those final weeks may never be known, and the remnants of its shadow logistic empire remain a haunting reminder that even when wars end, their mysteries do not.